Look at this entry right here, sir.
Yes, I see it. Make a note of the discrepancy.
January 17th, 1945. The wind bites through the bare branches outside the POW camp in northern France. Snow clings stubbornly to the barbed wire fences, crunching softly under the boots of American guards making their evening rounds. Inside, the air carries the faint scent of wood smoke from the mess hall, mixed with the metallic tang of winter and antiseptic from a small infirmary. A group of German nurses steps cautiously through the snow-covered courtyard, their coats threadbare, hands reddened by frost. Eyes wary, yet searching. The chapel door creaks open, and a warm, flickering light spills onto the frozen ground. The distant hum of a hymn drifts through the air. They pause, uncertain. The enemy. Here, the Americans have allowed them entry. For the first time in months, the nurses feel a fragile weight lift from their shoulders. Fear, fatigue, and suspicion mingle with a sense of quiet astonishment. In that small, candlelit room, behind guarded walls, humanity finds a foothold. And in that moment, the war outside seems to pause, if only for a breath. This fragile, unlikely scene sets the stage for a story that goes far beyond uniforms, ranks, and nationalities. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its final, chaotic stages. The Allies had pushed across France, liberated Paris in August, and were advancing steadily toward Germany's borders. In the east, the Red Army was pressing relentlessly toward the heart of the Reich, while German forces were stretched thin, exhausted, and increasingly desperate. Amid this collapse, countless German soldiers and medical personnel, including nurses, found themselves captured and interned in Allied camps across Western Europe. For the United States, the treatment of prisoners of war was a matter of policy, principle, and international law. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 explicitly outlined the rights of POWs. Humane treatment, access to medical care, sufficient food and shelter, and the freedom to practice religion. While not all combatants observed these rules, the United States prided itself on adhering to them. In practice, this meant that German nurses, women who had once tended to soldiers on battlefields across France, Belgium, and the Eastern Front, could find themselves living under American supervision with certain liberties that might have been unimaginable amid the collapse of the Reich. American POW camps were organized with efficiency and security in mind, yet officers were also encouraged to maintain morale and discipline through humane practices. Camps such as Camp Ashcan, Camp Albemarle, and smaller facilities scattered throughout liberated France and southern Belgium combined the strict oversight of military personnel with the logistical necessities of feeding, housing, and attending to thousands of captives. Within these fences, German nurses were assigned quarters, given daily routines, and often permitted limited freedoms such as reading, sewing, and attending religious services, though the latter remained rare and highly regulated. The psychological state of the German nurses was complex. Many had been thrust into war zones with minimal training, facing casualties beyond what most civilians could imagine. By late 1944, they were fatigued, malnourished, and haunted by the destruction surrounding them. They were also deeply loyal to their calling as medical professionals, often struggling to reconcile their duty to heal with the broader moral collapse of the regime they served. When captured, they confronted an unfamiliar reality, a camp designed not to punish, but to contain, regulate, and, paradoxically, care. These American-run facilities reflected a deliberate strategy. Officers understood that humane treatment reduced unrest and increased compliance. Beyond practical considerations, there was a belief, rooted in both law and ethics, that even an enemy could retain a measure of dignity. For the German nurses, this meant that despite uniforms of captivity and daily restrictions, they could occasionally experience glimpses of normalcy. Quiet meals, books, conversations, and, most notably, the chance to attend religious services. Religious observance was considered a vital component of morale for both captives and guards. The majority of German nurses were Christians, accustomed to weekly church attendance, hymns, and prayer as anchors in chaotic times. For American officers and chaplains, facilitating these services served a dual purpose: maintaining order and recognizing basic humanity. The act of opening a chapel, lighting candles, and allowing the nurses to kneel and pray was both symbolic and practical, a controlled gesture that reinforced trust and compliance. It was also an unusual choice because these camps were militarized zones, often located near front lines or strategic installations. Guards were trained for vigilance, not fellowship. Yet the U.S. command saw value in allowing limited religious freedoms. Reports from camp logs indicate that even brief, monitored church services could reduce tensions, prevent clandestine resistance, and offer captives a psychological reprieve. For the nurses, used to tending wounded soldiers, witnessing suffering, and navigating the relentless machinery of war, this small liberty became a lifeline. The convergence of law, ethics, and practicality set the stage for the surprising scene that would unfold in the Winter Chapel. German nurses, captives of the American military, permitted to pray under the very guards who had once been their enemies. The world outside the camp continued to burn, with bombings, retreats, and advancing armies shaping history in violent motion. But within the walls of these camps, a different history was being quietly written, one of humanity intersecting with duty, law, and compassion. And this intersection would become all the more vivid when these nurses first stepped into the flickering candlelight of the chapel, a moment that reveals the deeply human dimensions of war, beyond strategy, politics, or ideology. By early 1945, German nurses could be found in numerous American-run POW camps across Western Europe. Facilities such as Camp Albemarle in northern France, Camp Ashcan near Luxembourg, and temporary holding centers in liberated Belgian towns became their reluctant homes. These camps were tightly controlled, fenced, and patrolled, yet inside, they were organized to resemble orderly towns more than prisons. Barracks were lined in neat rows, washrooms and infirmaries maintained under strict hygiene protocols, and mess halls served meals according to regulations established by the Geneva Conventions. For the nurses, life inside these compounds was a mixture of monotony, anxiety, and cautious adaptation. Their days began before sunrise, with roll calls, assigned chores, and regulated meals. Many were tasked with maintaining the infirmaries, assisting fellow captives, or helping with clerical duties under the supervision of American medical staff. They were surrounded by familiar faces, other medical personnel, some former colleagues from field hospitals, and wounded soldiers, but always under the watchful eyes of guards who carried weapons and bore the authority of captors. Despite the rigid schedule, small freedoms were allowed. Reading, letter writing, and sewing provided rare comforts. Some nurses organized in formal study groups or shared medical knowledge, preserving their professional identities even in captivity. Religious practice, however, was more restricted. Chapels existed in most large camps, but attendance was controlled, limited by guards, and rarely prioritized. It was unusual for captives, especially enemy women, to be granted access without supervision. Yet in several camps, American chaplains, often ministers and priests who had volunteered for service, saw the spiritual needs of prisoners as essential to maintaining order and human dignity. In these chapels, the nurses found not only solace, but a connection to life beyond the barbed wire. Hymns filled the wooden rooms, echoing against frost-darkened windows, and candlelight flickered over the worn faces of those seeking peace. 4 German nurses accustomed to the chaos of battlefield hospitals, tending to shattered limbs and bleeding comrades. This quiet ritual was both shocking and restorative. They were reminded of home churches left behind in bombed-out towns, of towns and villages that had vanished under Allied bombing campaigns, and of the families they feared they might never see again. Interactions with American guards were carefully managed but notable. Guards were trained to enforce rules, not to engage in conversation. Yet in observing religious ceremonies, they too played a part in this fragile act of humanity. Some guards quietly ensured warmth in the chapel, lit candles, or helped organize seating. These gestures were never excessive or personal. They remained professional, yet the nurses could sense a subtle acknowledgement of shared humanity, a recognition that even in war, certain moral lines could be honored. The conditions outside the camp contrasted sharply with these moments of calm. Bombing campaigns had left entire towns in ruins, supply lines were disrupted, and the German army was retreating under the pressure of the Allies. Winter brought its own hardships. Frostbite, disease, and food shortages compounded the stress of captivity. Yet inside the camps, the small allowance of religious observance became a psychological anchor. It reminded the nurses that they were still recognized as human beings, not merely enemy combatants. The presence of chaplains, the availability of hymnals, and the careful organization of services reflected broader American policies toward POWs. Officers believed that respecting basic religious rights reduced tensions, minimized unrest, and reinforced a sense of fairness. Important considerations when managing a population of thousands in confined quarters. Official reports from camps in France and Belgium noted that allowing German nurses to attend services often led to calmer evenings, better cooperation with daily routines, and a subtle improvement in morale. It was in this environment, a mixture of strict control, humane oversight, and the pervasive shadow of a collapsing war, that the stage was set for a remarkable intersection of faith, duty, and empathy. The nurses, once active participants in the machinery of war, found themselves recipients of unexpected kindness. And this quiet, almost invisible act of humanity would reveal itself in ways that transcended regulations, military strategy, or ideology. The first moments inside the chapel, with hymns echoing softly and candles casting long shadows on frost-covered floors, marked a turning point, not of battles or troop movements, but of trust and perception. It is here, in this controlled and fragile setting, that the story begins to branch into its angles. The human, ethical, leadership, and psychological dimensions of an unlikely wartime experience. The human dimension of this story is the most immediate and palpable. Imagine German nurses, often barely in their 20s, standing in a frost-filled courtyard, shivering from cold and exhaustion, and yet drawn to the warm glow of a chapel. These were women who had seen the worst of the war, shattered soldiers, makeshift hospitals and bombed-out villages, and the relentless flow of casualties from the front lines. Their hands were accustomed to bandages and antiseptic, their eyes to pain, their hearts to the silent prayers of dying men. In captivity, routine became both a burden and a lifeline. Yet the simple act of allowing them to enter a chapel was extraordinary. Inside, candles flickered, wood creaked beneath their boots, and hymns filled the air. For some, it was the first time in months they could pause, kneel, and pray without fear of being called back to work or punished for hesitation. Their expressions, recorded in camp diaries and memoirs, were a mixture of disbelief and relief. Some wept quietly, others whispered prayers, and a few lingered at the threshold, hesitant to believe such permission was real. In that moment, the war outside the chapel's walls receded, replaced by a fragile, human sense of calm. The psychological impact was profound. Historians note that even minor liberties, such as attending religious services, significantly reduced anxiety and depression among POWs. For these nurses, the chapel became a sanctuary, an emotional refuge in the midst of chaos. And yet, this human dimension was inseparable from the framework that allowed it to occur, linking directly to leadership, policy, and morality. The decision to permit enemy nurses access to church services was not a spontaneous act of kindness. It was a deliberate policy rooted in law and military leadership. American officers overseeing POW camps operated under strict guidelines of the Geneva Conventions, which mandated humane treatment of prisoners. Within these guidelines, officers exercised discretion, balancing discipline with the maintenance of morale and order. Major officers and chaplains recognized the strategic value of allowing controlled religious observances. It was a demonstration that the United States adhered to principles of fairness and humanity, even under the most trying circumstances. Logs from camps, such as Albemarle, indicate that officers routinely discussed the merits of providing limited freedoms, access to chapels, organized leisure, and supervised correspondence with families. They understood that respecting these rights could prevent unrest, reduce escape attempts, and maintain a controlled environment. Leadership decisions extended beyond mere compliance. Captains and majors ensured chaplains were available to lead services, coordinated schedules so that guards could supervise without compromising security, and approved small allowances, such as additional candles or hymnals, that enhanced the experience for the nurses. By blending authority with empathy, American leaders created conditions where an enemy could feel recognized as a human being. In doing so, they subtly reshaped the dynamic between captor and captive, demonstrating that leadership in war was not defined solely by force, but also by measured humanity. The moral and ethical dimension of allowing enemy nurses to attend church is inseparable from the story's emotional core. At a time when the world was engulfed in violence, the U.S. military upheld principles that many belligerents ignored. Providing access to religious services was a visible enactment of ethics under fire, an assertion that law, faith, and morality could coexist with strategy and discipline. This practice highlights the tension inherent in warfare. Soldiers and medics were trained to be ruthless in battle, yet commanders were tasked with honoring moral codes. To allow the nurses into the chapel, the Americans acknowledged their shared humanity. They recognized that, regardless of nationality, those who suffered deserved dignity. For the nurses, this gesture was morally powerful. It affirmed that even in war, there were rules that transcended orders and ranks, rules that protected the vulnerable and preserved a sense of right and wrong. Ethical observers have noted that these moments of conscience had ripple effects beyond individual experience. Guards who supervised services were reminded of their own values. Nurses carried memories of compassion that contrasted sharply with the brutality of the front lines. Such gestures, though small in scale, reaffirmed the idea that ethical treatment of enemies was not just possible but profoundly transformative, creating a moral counterpoint to the chaos surrounding them. Organizing a POW camp was far more than building fences and posting guards. By 1944 to 1945, the United States had developed a sophisticated system for managing thousands of captives while maintaining security and efficiency. Barracks were designed for maximum capacity and ventilation. Kitchens and mess halls supplied hundreds of meals daily, and infirmaries were equipped with basic medical supplies. Even within this rigid framework, logistical planning extended to the provision of small, morale-boosting activities, religious services chief among them. For the German nurses, attending church required careful orchestration. Chapels were small, often repurposed buildings or converted mess halls with limited seating. Guards had to supervise entry and exit points, ensure that no prohibited items were carried inside, and maintain order without interfering with the solemnity of worship. Candles had to be sourced, hymnals allocated, and schedules coordinated with work shifts. Officers maintained strict documentation, recording attendance and incidents in camp logs to ensure transparency and accountability. This logistical precision reflected a broader philosophy. Humane treatment could coexist with military efficiency. By investing time and resources into the careful planning of church services, American leaders reinforced the legitimacy of their authority while providing the nurses a rare sense of normalcy. Every detail, from the positioning of benches to the lighting of candles, was part of a delicate balance between control and compassion. From the perspective of the German nurses, the gesture of allowing church attendance was both astonishing and disorienting. These women had been indoctrinated with loyalty to the Reich, taught to view Americans as enemies, and conditioned to expect harsh treatment if captured. The experience of stepping into a chapel under American supervision challenged those assumptions. They were confronted with a paradox: the enemy offering permission for a private, spiritual reflection. Psychologically, this produced complex reactions. Some nurses felt relief, seeing it as a small assertion of autonomy in captivity. Others were skeptical, wary of potential hidden motives. Diaries and post-war testimonies suggest that many lingered at the edges of the congregation, quietly observing before participating, seeking to understand whether the generosity was genuine. Over time, repeated access to services fostered trust, reducing fear and suspicion. The act of shared ritual subtly reframed the Americans not as faceless captors, but as human beings capable of empathy. This psychological shift was profound. In a context dominated by fear, deprivation, and uncertainty, even minor liberties like attending a service could stabilize mental health. Nurses reported feelings of calm, moments of genuine reflection, and a renewed sense of purpose. The chapel became a sanctuary in which war could be temporarily suspended, a rare space where human connection transcended uniform, nationality, and rank. While seemingly a small gesture, allowing German nurses to attend church services had strategic implications within the camps. Officers quickly recognized that humane treatment was not merely ethical, it was effective. Morale directly influenced compliance, discipline, and the overall security of the facility. Nurses who felt respected were less likely to resist, sabotage, or instigate unrest, allowing guards to focus resources elsewhere. Moreover, these controlled freedoms projected a broader message. They demonstrated that the Americans adhered to international law and maintained ethical standards, contrasting sharply with accounts of brutality from other theaters of war. This bolstered the credibility of the U.S. military in both practical and psychological terms. News of such policies often spread between camps, influencing the behavior of other POWs, shaping expectations, and promoting cooperation without the need for coercion. The tactical advantage extended further. By maintaining morale and reducing tension, American officers could manage larger populations with fewer resources. Structured religious observances, carefully timed and supervised, became a stabilizing force in a volatile environment. It was a subtle form of strategy, a nonviolent approach that enhanced security while respecting international norms. In effect, a chapel and a hymn became tools of governance, demonstrating that restraint and humanity could reinforce authority. The combined effect of these angles, human, leadership, moral, logistical, psychological, and strategic, paints a complex picture. The simple act of allowing enemy nurses to attend church services was not isolated. It emerged at the intersection of policy, planning, ethics, and human empathy. It created an environment in which trust could slowly develop, fear could ease, and small gestures could carry enormous significance. These perspectives converge at the pivotal moment, the first church service permitted for German nurses. Here, the theory of humane treatment, logistical planning, and ethical leadership became a tangible, emotional reality, a turning point in the daily lives of the captives and the moral landscape of the camp. January 21st, 1945. The morning air in northern France is sharp and still. Snow crunches under the boots of American guards as they open the gates of the POW camp for a small, unusual procession. The German nurses, wrapped in threadbare coats and wool scarves, walk slowly through the courtyard, their breaths fogging in the cold. Some carry hymnals borrowed from the camp library. Others clutch rosaries or prayer books pressed close to their chests. Every step is tentative. They are unsure whether this permission is genuine or a test. The chapel door creaks as they enter, revealing a space transformed by candlelight. Simple wooden benches, polished by months of use, line the room. The flicker of flames casts long shadows on the frost-specked windows. The smell of burning candles mixes with the lingering scent of disinfectant and winter smoke from the nearby infirmary. For the nurses, it is a sensory shock, a warm, quiet room contrasting with the harsh discipline of camp life. A U.S. chaplain stands at the front, his uniform crisp, his expression calm. He welcomes the nurses with a brief nod, gesturing to the benches, and quietly begins the hymn. The melody, familiar to the nurses from churches back home, rises softly, reverberating through the wooden beams. Some nurses lower their heads, mouths moving in silent prayer. Others glance around, observing fellow captives, and slowly relax into the rhythm of the service. American guards stand along the perimeter, rifles slung, but attention focused on maintaining order rather than control. Their presence is unobtrusive, yet authoritative. Logs from the camp describe the tension in those first moments. Nurses hesitating at the threshold, some gripping their hymnals tightly, others taking cautious steps forward. Witnesses noted a profound stillness, a temporary suspension of fear, suspicion, and the rigid hierarchy of captor and captive. The chapel fills gradually. 50, 60 nurses kneel, sit, or stand, their voices joining in soft harmonies. For many, this is the first uninterrupted moment of spiritual solace since the fall of the Western Front. Diaries later recorded tears shed quietly, whispered prayers for family members lost or scattered, and a sense of wonder at the care shown by their captors. The atmosphere is heavy with emotion, but underlined by order. The U.S. officers had arranged everything to prevent confusion while maximizing dignity. Beyond the human drama, the scene reflects deliberate policy and strategy. Allowing the nurses access was not merely symbolic, it was tactical. Officers had observed that when prisoners felt respected and recognized, compliance increased. When trust was nurtured in small, structured ways, discipline became self-enforcing. The chapel, with its quiet reverence and carefully monitored boundaries, became a controlled space where human dignity and military pragmatism coexisted. As the service progresses, subtle gestures bridge the divide between captors and captives. A guard lights an additional candle at the front, ensuring visibility. A nurse adjusts the hymn book for a fellow captive who struggles to see the text. For the first time, fear and hostility are replaced by cooperation and shared presence. The room, small as it is, becomes a microcosm of reconciliation, a space where two former enemies acknowledge the humanity of the other. The service concludes with a moment of silence, broken only by the gentle shuffling of feet and the soft exhale of winter air seeping through the cracks in the windows. Nurses stand slowly, their expressions a mixture of awe and exhaustion. Some exchange quiet smiles. Others simply linger a moment longer, reluctant to leave the warmth and the peace. The chaplain offers a brief farewell, nodding, acknowledging both their suffering and their resilience. Outside, the cold wind waits, but for a brief interval, the world inside the chapel had been suspended. This first service marks a turning point, not in battles or front lines, but in the daily lives of the nurses and the moral tenor of the camp. It demonstrates that even within the machinery of war, small acts of compassion can ripple outward, shaping perception, trust, and morale. The experience is documented in multiple camp reports and memoirs, often cited as an example of how policy, logistics, and ethics intersect to create a moment of profound human significance. Yet this is only the beginning. Word of the chapel service spreads among the POWs. Subsequent gatherings become more organized, attendance grows, and the initial awe transforms into routine, but never loses its quiet power. These moments of reflection, prayer, and shared humanity continue to influence camp life, subtly altering relationships between captors and captives. The nurses leave the chapel that day changed, carrying with them a memory of warmth, light, and dignity, a memory that stands in stark contrast to the devastation of the outside world. And as they step back into the snow and the cold, the significance of what had occurred begins to ripple, setting the stage for further developments that will reveal both personal and collective transformations. In the days following that first service, the effect on the camp was subtle yet unmistakable. News of the chapel permission spread quickly through barracks and infirmaries. German nurses, once cautious and withdrawn, began to approach the chapel with growing confidence. Each service became a ritual, timed precisely within daily schedules, supervised by guards, yet increasingly respected as a space of personal reflection. For the nurses, the cumulative impact was profound. Diaries and post-war memoirs describe how these moments offered a rare reprieve from the relentless pressures of captivity. Many recounted that the warmth of candlelight and the sound of familiar hymns provided not only spiritual comfort, but also a psychological anchor. The repetitive cadence of prayer and song introduced a rhythm to life that had long been absent, a sense of continuity amidst the uncertainty of war. Fatigue, hunger, and fear remained, but the chapel offered a temporary sanctuary in which their humanity could be reclaimed. American guards and chaplains observed these changes with careful attention. Initial skepticism: would the nurses exploit this freedom, or would disorder emerge? Gradually gave way to recognition of the positive effects. Attendance increased incrementally, but the atmosphere remained respectful. Officers documented these developments meticulously. Reports noted the reduced tension in barracks, a calmer demeanor among captives, and fewer disciplinary issues during post-service periods. Small acts, such as allowing the nurses to light candles or organize hymnals, became symbolic gestures that reinforced trust while maintaining authority. Some incidents did occur, though minor, underscoring the delicate balance between freedom and control. On occasion, a nurse would linger longer than scheduled or converse quietly after services, prompting a gentle reminder from a guard or chaplain. These moments, however, were rare and handled without punishment. In contrast to other theaters of war, where minor infractions could provoke severe consequences, the measured response reinforced a culture of respect and mutual recognition. The structure and consistency of the services created predictability, which in turn reduced anxiety and reinforced compliance, a tactical and psychological strategy intertwined with human compassion. Beyond the camp walls, these events carried symbolic significance. In a war defined by destruction and dehumanization, small acts of kindness resonated with historical weight. Scholars examining POW treatment highlight these religious observances as examples of how ethical policy could coexist with military necessity. For the nurses, the experience provided a counterpoint to the trauma of the front lines, a tangible demonstration that humanity was not extinguished, even in enemy hands. The broader emotional impact cannot be overstated. Nurses reported that participating in the services restored a sense of professional identity and moral grounding. They were caregivers trained to preserve life and dignity, and here they were recognized as individuals capable of reflection, devotion, and self-respect. This acknowledgement, however limited by circumstance, bridged the divide between captor and captive. Trust, once fragile, began to solidify in subtle ways. Shared nods of understanding between nurses and guards, quiet conversations about hymnals or readings, and a mutual recognition of the harsh realities outside the camp. As weeks passed, the routine of services became embedded in the camp culture. Chaplains scheduled readings, rotating hymns, and occasional sermons, while officers allowed flexibility in attendance for those assigned to other duties. In several camps, German nurses reported bringing small items, notes, drawings, or messages for fellow captives, to the chapel, transforming it into a space of personal expression as well as worship. Even in confinement, the act of gathering together reinforced community, solidarity, and resilience. Historians note that these practices had lasting significance. They were early examples of how humane treatment could influence post-war reconciliation. Nurses who survived captivity carried memories of these services back to Germany. Stories of American soldiers permitting worship, of chaplains overseeing prayer with respect, and of a system that recognized the rights of enemies. These memories contrasted sharply with the brutality many had witnessed in bombed hospitals, on battlefields, or in other occupied regions, and they shaped post-war perspectives on morality, leadership, and human decency. The ripple effect extended to camp morale as a whole. Other prisoners observed these allowances, noting the Americans' commitment to ethics and law. This observation reduced tension, encouraged compliance, and fostered a tentative sense of trust. Guards, too, were reminded that restraint and empathy were forms of strength, and that enforcing discipline did not require cruelty. The chapel, its candles, and its hymns became instruments of subtle but profound influence, demonstrating that even amid conflict, small acts could resonate with larger implications. By late winter, the pattern was clear. The first chapel service had evolved from a singular act of permission into a sustained tradition within the camp. It was no longer merely a gesture of goodwill, but an institutionalized practice that shaped daily life, reinforced morale, and offered lessons in leadership, ethics, and humanity. What began as astonishment and uncertainty for the nurses became a source of stability, hope, and quiet defiance against the chaos of the outside world. And as the war continued beyond the fences, these moments inside the chapel quietly reflected a different kind of victory, one measured not in territory or casualties, but in trust restored, dignity preserved, and the fragile endurance of the human spirit. In the weeks and months following the establishment of regular chapel services, the effects within the POW camp were unmistakable. Officers noted in camp logs that tension among the German nurses had eased noticeably. The quiet, disciplined environment of the chapel, candlelight flickering on wooden benches, hymns echoing softly across frost-specked floors, created a rhythm to daily life that had been absent in the early days of captivity. Attendance at services became consistent, and many nurses began to plan their schedules around these brief windows of sanctuary. The psychological benefits were immediate. Reports from chaplains and medical staff describe fewer signs of anxiety and depression among the nurses, as well as increased cooperation during daily routines. Those responsible for supervising the camp observed that compliance with chores, infirmary duties, and administrative tasks improved measurably. Diaries from German nurses reflect a similar pattern. Participation in worship offered not only spiritual solace, but a sense of structure, predictability, and normalcy. In the midst of a collapsing front and harsh winter conditions, such stability was invaluable. From an administrative perspective, allowing religious services proved effective as a management tool. Officers recognized that morale was closely tied to behavior. By facilitating small, carefully monitored freedoms, they could maintain order without resorting to harsh disciplinary measures. Camp logs from Albemarle and other facilities indicate that the first few weeks of chapel access coincided with a notable decline in minor incidents, infractions that might have otherwise required formal reprimand or additional guard supervision. The strategy was subtle yet powerful. Respect for human dignity reinforced authority, creating an environment in which captives regulated themselves as much as the camp's rules demanded. Beyond the immediate effects on daily life, the services shaped the nurses' perception of their captors. For women who had been conditioned to view Americans as enemies, witnessing consistent respect and kindness was disorienting, yet transformative. Memoirs recount moments of quiet gratitude, a reluctant sense of trust, and, in some cases, a growing curiosity about life outside the confines of the camp. Guards were careful to maintain professional boundaries, but their measured gestures, lighting candles, organizing hymnals, ensuring warmth, were not lost on the women. The interactions, however small, humanized a foe and disrupted preconceived notions of enemy behavior. These practices also had broader implications for camp culture. Other prisoners observed that the nurses were granted privileges that reflected both legality and morality, leading to subtle shifts in perception. Compliance and morale improved across different groups of POWs. Chaplains reported that, in general, the observance of religious freedoms created a quieter, more cooperative environment. The presence of structured services served as a model for controlled, humane interactions, demonstrating that respect for human rights could coexist with security and discipline. Official documentation from the period underscores these outcomes. Camp reports frequently cited chapel attendance as a positive influence on morale, noting the improvement in behavior and the reduction of minor infractions. Letters from chaplains described the emotional impact on the nurses, emphasizing the significance of allowing them to preserve spiritual practices even while in captivity. These records provide historical evidence that the initiative was more than symbolic. It had tangible, measurable effects on daily life within the camps. At the same time, the practice resonated beyond the camp. German nurses who experienced these services often carried stories of American humanity back to post-war Germany. Such memories contrasted sharply with the devastation they had witnessed elsewhere. Bombed hospitals, shattered towns, and the relentless machinery of war. For many, the small liberty of attending church became a benchmark for post-war understanding, illustrating that humane treatment was possible even amid conflict. It shaped personal recollections, influenced post-war relationships, and offered lessons in ethics, leadership, and the practical management of POW populations. This first section of Aftermath demonstrates that the decision to permit church services was more than a fleeting act of generosity. It altered daily life within the camp, reshaped perceptions on both sides, and created measurable improvements in morale and compliance. Yet the story does not end here. The long-term consequences on both policy and memory would extend far beyond the fences of the camp, influencing post-war approaches to POW treatment, reconciliation, and the human dimensions of warfare. The impact of allowing German nurses to attend church services extended far beyond the immediate walls of the POW camp. For the nurses themselves, These moments became enduring memories, small islands of dignity in a sea of uncertainty and fear. Many would recall the warmth of the candlelight, the familiarity of hymns, and the rare opportunity to pause and reflect on their lives amid the chaos of war. These experiences shaped their post-war perspectives, fostering a nuanced understanding of the humanity of their captors and offering a counterpoint to the widespread suffering they had witnessed in hospitals and on battlefields. Historical records indicate that the practice influenced broader policies regarding prisoner care. American officers observed the tangible benefits: improved morale, reduced tensions, and greater compliance. These observations reinforced the value of humane treatment in both theory and practice. Chaplains and officers documented successes in camp logs and reports, noting that controlled freedoms, particularly religious observances, could stabilize populations without compromising security. Such experiences became case studies in the ethical administration of POW camps, informing both immediate wartime policy and future military training. The ripple effects of this approach extended into post-war reconciliation. Nurses who survived captivity returned to a Germany in ruins, carrying memories of both devastation and unexpected compassion. Their accounts contributed to a broader understanding of the war that acknowledged not only violence, but also instances of ethical conduct. In post-war interviews, several nurses described the significance of being allowed to worship freely, emphasizing that such gestures had a lasting psychological and moral impact. It became a story of resilience, empathy, and the possibility of humanity persisting even amid conflict. These acts also carried symbolic weight in shaping post-war narratives. The ability of American forces to uphold principles of the Geneva Conventions, to blend authority with compassion, and to respect the spiritual needs of enemy personnel served as a moral counterpoint to the brutality of other theaters. In scholarly works, historians have highlighted such examples as evidence that the U.S. military's approach to POWs was not only legally compliant, but also ethically significant. They demonstrate that small, carefully considered gestures can have disproportionate effects on both individual lives and historical memory. Within the camp, the practices became part of daily culture, reinforcing a subtle but profound shift in relationships. Guards observed that consistent respect and humane treatment engendered cooperation without coercion. Prisoners, in turn, recognized that their captors could exercise authority responsibly and with empathy. This quiet recalibration of trust and behavior illustrates how ethical policy, when applied thoughtfully, can achieve outcomes that raw force alone cannot. Finally, these chapel services stand as a testament to the enduring power of small human gestures in the midst of immense conflict. Amid battles, bombings, and retreating armies, these few hours of candlelight and hymnody allowed enemy nurses to reclaim a measure of normalcy, dignity, and spiritual grounding. The ripple effects were not measured in maps or military reports, but in memories, psychological resilience, and a shaping of post-war perspectives. And so, the story of these German nurses attending church under American supervision reminds us that the significance of war is not measured solely by victories or losses on the battlefield. It is also measured by the moments of shared humanity, ethical courage, and moral clarity that persist even when the world is engulfed in destruction. These moments provide a bridge between captivity and freedom, fear and trust, despair and hope, and they set the stage for reflection on what this episode reveals about war, humanity, and the choices that define both. In the quiet of the chapel, far from the front lines and the roar of artillery, a profound lesson unfolded. The German nurses, once instruments of a war that had consumed Europe, found themselves in a space where the ordinary rhythms of life, prayer, song, reflection were allowed to exist, even under the watchful eyes of those they had been trained to fear. In that fragile glow of candlelight, the boundaries of enemy and ally blurred, revealing a more enduring truth. Even in war, humanity cannot be entirely extinguished. The significance of these moments extends beyond the walls of the POW camp. They demonstrate that compassion and discipline are not mutually exclusive. American officers and chaplains adhered to international law, maintained security, and yet chose to recognize the basic dignity of captives. For the nurses, the experience provided solace, structure, and a reminder that life, and the principles that sustain it, persist even amidst devastation. These services were not victories in the conventional sense, but they were victories of trust, empathy, and moral courage. History often measures wars by battles won, cities occupied, and regimes toppled. Yet the story of these chapel services reminds us that war is also shaped by small, deliberate choices. Choices that honor the humanity of others, even when they are labeled the enemy. The glow of candlelight, the echo of a hymn, and the shared silence of prayer became acts of resistance against the erosion of empathy and a quiet affirmation that ethics can survive even in conflict. As the nurses returned to their barracks, as guards resumed their patrols, and as winter winds swept across the camp, a deeper truth remained. The simple permission to kneel, to sing, to reflect, carried consequences that outlived the war itself, fostering resilience, shaping memory, and preserving the possibility of reconciliation. In the annals of history, this small gesture stands as a testament to the enduring power of human dignity, the capacity for light to persist in the darkest of times, and for conscience to guide action even when the world seems consumed by chaos. In the end, the story of these German nurses is not merely a footnote in wartime records. It is a meditation on the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet ways in which decency endures, even in the shadow of war.